In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
Yesterday I went, as we all must, to Peppa Pig World.
I'm not going to answer the question.
Why
because,
would you answer that
because
question?
the question is, the question is,
Justice,
the
radical
question,
left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
Fancy watching a couple of rounds of heavyweight boxing? Or how about those massive sumo guys grappling with each other?
Anybody who thinks that I was partying, having a knees-ups in number 10, anybody thinks that civil servants were setting out to break the rules, and we all knew
Mr. Johnson, we saw the trolley loads of Prosecco being taken in from the local co-op or Sainsbury's.
Did you see a trolley load of Prosecco?
Yes, they went out and got them like those airbags.
You actually have footage of a trolley load of Prosecco.
I don't, but ITV or what BBC has. Yes, there is they were taking trolley loads of booze in. Why am I telling you that?
Because
I
think you're talking total tripe. I don't think there is any such footage.
You don't know about the parties when I understand your own son's swing was broken.
Sorry.
You're aware of that party?
Listen, I think
you are because of the way you've changed.
No, what I can tell you is that I don't believe for a second that officials thought they were breaking the rules.
That was good. But what about the old ask the same question 14 times manoeuvre?
Did you threaten to overrule him?
I did not overrule Derek Lewis.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
I took advice on what I could or could not do.
Did you threaten to overrule him, Mr. Howard?
Scrupulously in accordance with that advice. I did not overrule Derek Lewis.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
Mr. Marriott was not suspended.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
I have accounted for my decision to dismiss Derek Lewis.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
Detail before the House of Commons.
I note you're not answering the question whether you threatened to overrule him.
The important aspect of this, which it's very clear to bear in mind.
I'm sorry, I'm going to be frightfully rude, but
yes, you can.
I'm sorry. It's a quite straight yes or no.
Question and I would give you an answer.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
And then there's the kick 'em when they're down strategy, as applied by that old trooper Robin Day to Thatcher's outgoing Defence Secretary, John Nott.
My task is to maintain a balance between all three services, and most expert opinion, setting aside those who want to drive divisions between the services, is of the opinion that we've probably got the balance about right.
But why should the public on this issue, as regards the future of the Royal Navy, believe you, a transient, here today and, if I may say so, gone tomorrow politician, rather than a senior officer of many years?
I'm fed up with this interview, really. It's a ridiculous ruling.
Well, thank you, Mr. Nott.
Journalists as watchdogs, their barks as fierce as any Rottweiler squeezing the truth out of cornered politicians. And that kind of journalism is often quite useful in casting light on facts that politicians would otherwise seek to cover up in the wrapping of slick rhetoric. There's something democratically refreshing about seeing power pricked by the puncture of a well-crafted question. But political journalism should be rather more than relentless pummelling and knockout blows, shouldn't it? In a post-truth era in which even the most basic claim about reality is open to contestation, often by appeals that bypass evidence, should we demand more from journalism than raw exposure? So, what should be the role of the intelligent, critical, trusted political journalist? Well, let me suggest 3 roles. First of all, the translator. We need journalists who are authoritative decoders, who know the strategic techniques of evasion and obfuscation, and are able to cut through them to meaning. This entails more than asking challenging questions, but rather providing critically intelligent summations of what politicians are actually saying. Let the audience make up their own minds about whether what they're saying is right or wrong, true or false, feasible or impractical. What I want to know before anything else is what this politician actually believes and intends to do. Interviews with politicians that can extract from them what they really think and mean and intend offer much greater insight than those in which politicians are interrogated as if they exist solely to deceive. Now, this will often mean giving politicians much more time to explain themselves, but it certainly doesn't mean simply allowing them to control the situation. Drawing out meanings and intentions involves sensitive, critical questioning, as any psychoanalyst will testify. But that need not be implacably incredulous. And so to the second role of the political journalist, the close observer. The best journalists, I've always thought, are like art critics, explaining and interpreting the craft of their subjects. They tell us what the politician is trying to achieve and how they are going about it. They delve into the techniques of self-presentation, not in order to crudely expose, but to perceptively explore another person's perspective. Again, this need not involve what the philosopher Paul Ricoeur referred to as the hermeneutics of suspicion, whereby every move made has to be sceptically deciphered as if it might reveal underlying or repressed lies and illusions. Instead of that, much can be learned by asking questions such as, why is this politician giving salience to these facts about the world while not mentioning others? How does this politician choose to name problems, identify causes, and link them to specific effects? Why that way of seeing the world and not others? What kind of evidence does this politician draw upon, and how far is evidence to the contrary taken into consideration? What sort of moral tone is a politician adopting? Authoritative, consensus-seeking, open-minded, partisan? What is a politician asking us to do? Indeed, how far does she take account of our agency within the context of what is being discussed? These are standard questions for frame and discourse analysts within academia, but journalists could be so much better than we are at answering them succinctly and accessibly. And a third role for political journalists, identifiers of relevance. How might what this politician is saying have practical consequences for my life? Why should I care? If I care, what can I do? If I can do something, what do we know about what works? Too often we're asked by journalists to care about what politicians say or do because of its impact upon their position within the strategic game of politics. But for most of us, that matters far less than how their words will affect our lives and those of the people we care about. Now, the very best political journalists do all three of these things. They translate, they closely observe, they identify relevance, at least some of the time. But I wonder whether the quality of democratic life would be richer if more of them did it more of the time, opening up politics to people as something less like a gladiatorial battle and more like a civic arena. These were particularly important questions in the two recent elections that we've discussed quite often on this podcast. The British one, in which the most important policy options tended to be scrupulously ignored, and the US one, in which choice was turned into a Manichaean battle between good and evil. Looking towards the next elections, and the long years leading up to them, could we hope for a different tone from political journalism? More long form, more insights, more likely to engage us as thinking citizens. Let me explore those questions further with Darryl Morris, who presents the weekend late show on Times Radio. He covered both the UK and US elections and interviewed Donald Trump's former Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, after the Trump victory. Darryl, most people don't think a lot about politics, and when you interview a politician, what do you most want to offer those people?
That is such a great question, actually. And I think the truth is that it's often multifaceted, what you're looking for. There are also competing interests, and I think it's important to understand what those competing interests are, right? Because, I mean, I'd like to say first and foremost, but whether it's foremost or not depends on the context and the interviewer. But you are looking to hold to account somebody in a position of power. You know, that is perhaps the most kind of, worthy bit of the job. You have in front of you somebody who's going to make decisions that are going to impact people's lives. You hold them to account for the decisions that they've made or the decisions that they may make. You may also be looking for clarity on something, and you're probably doing both of those things, to kind of in tandem. And here's where the sort of competing interests start to come in a little bit, because the honest truth is, and I'd like to talk in the fullness of our chat about the kind of media economy and the way that it's shifting the way that we do these things. But there is also, ultimately you are also perhaps looking for a news line. You're looking to get out of them a piece of information that is exclusive, that perhaps gives you something that you can sell. Ultimately, for better or worse, and we can perhaps decide over the course of our conversation which of those it is. I've got my own opinion. For better or worse, we live in an age in which we rely on getting people to listen to us or watch us or read our articles. And they will do that if there is a piece of information that is new or is juicy or is different or is eye-catching in some way. And so it is a harsh and unfortunate reality that a lot of the times in those interviews you are looking for maybe a gotcha or a news line or something like that. And again, I will caveat my point there with the fact that I don't necessarily think that's always a good thing. I don't think it's always necessarily a healthy thing for either the media ecosystem or our politics or democracy. But I think in the interest of honesty, I should tell you that that's what's going on in our thinking. And actually, those things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, nor do they work against each other, actually, because, you want your politicians to fear a little bit. You want your politicians to feel as though they are on their toes and that there is jeopardy in the conversation that they are having, because you want them to be, you don't want them to be sort of too relaxed, really. It's democracy relies on us holding these people to account, and all of those things I think combine to make that happen.
That's really interesting. Let's move on a little later to talk about the media system, but thinking about the political system, which in our case I suppose we might broadly, perhaps a bit generously, call democracy. Do you think that journalists might be spending so much time proving politicians to be faithless, deceptive actors that they fail to help people understand what those elected are really trying to say and really trying to do?
Yes, I think that's absolutely a fair charge. It links us to a conversation about the media ecosystem in that the media economy, in many ways, demands that. Yeah. I also think it's become something of a sport. I think that, a combination of the necessity for media organisations to create content that generates clicks and gets views and potentially goes viral and, reaches a wide audience rather than the right audience with the right content.
Yeah.
That has for sure created a climate in which journalists are going for those moments rather than perhaps drilling into issues that help people understand their world and understand what their politicians are doing. And I think that we are absolutely poorer for that. And I think that I think it is a component of the sort of the decaying trust in politics. Very interesting that you sort of refer to democracy as a generous term for what we have. But I think that people feeling that way is intrinsically linked to the quality of the conversation, the quality of the discourse that we have in our politics. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? In that every day, literally every day, I will listen to an interview on the radio or on television or reading it, and politicians are talking around answers, that very familiar rhythm and cadence and avoidance that we see them engage in on a regular basis, because they are terrified of saying the wrong thing and it being, having the headline being misconstrued or being sort of judged a misstep and that having a personal and professional impact on them. And I think a lot of, I think in a sense that the media has some responsibility for the way that we have conducted ourselves for that happening. And we all come away poorer for it, I think.
I'm going to ask you a question that I hadn't actually planned to ask you.
They're the best ones.
Because I'm enjoying hearing you speak. And my mind went back to something at the university many years ago. And I remember we were talking about journalists and we were talking about the kind of points that you were just making. And I remember saying, look, these guys have got to earn a living and that's what they do and they're part of this system and all the rest of it. And one of my colleagues said to me, don't let them off that lightly. They have a responsibility here. They have an enormous effect on the way that the political system works or doesn't work. I mean, from a personal point of view, Darryl, how do you find yourself negotiating that? And I'm not asking you in any sense to apologise for what you do, because I think you do a great job. My question is, given the dilemmas that you've identified, what's the advice to other journalists that you would offer?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I'm in an interesting position in regard to that, I think, because I do a radio show, and actually the radio station, I would stick up for the radio station that I work for, which is Times Radio, not just because it is professionally helpful to do that, but also because I genuinely feel it, I genuinely believe it. We have a bit of a mantra on Times Radio that we don't badger, we don't relent to sort of clickbaity things. That isn't to say that we do not fiercely hold people to account when we need to, and we should, and when the moment is right and we get the tone right. It doesn't mean that we don't ask the awkward, difficult question that may also in turn get us a headline and get us some attention and all that sort of stuff. But we do so, I think, with an understanding that our audience are looking for a little bit more depth. We make a big thing of that. Conversation, not confrontation, and that extends to a lot of our broadcasting. So, in a sense, I mean, kind of like I'm in sort of ideal place really for the way that I think and feel, because the platform on which I work, we embrace that. There's just one other sort of caveat to my point that I would make as well, is that I think that we're talking here about a relatively small number, I think, of quite high-profile journalists who engage in the sort of most extreme examples of this, and we're also talking about actually a very small number of politicians who are on the extreme end of it as well, right? And the vast majority of journalists in all newsrooms all over the country, regardless of what you think of the title they work for or the news outlet they work for, they are decent, dedicated, hardworking people who have a strong sense of service and duty to the public as well as their publication. And they are working very hard, working diligently and honestly, and doing a very good job, and are incredibly important in terms of holding power to account, telling stories, amplifying voices, all those sorts of things. And on the other side of the spectrum, on the other side of that divide in politics, the vast majority of people who work in politics are hard-working public servants who've got into it for the right reasons, who spend all day grafting, not engaging in the melodramas of Westminster necessarily, or even engaging with the big issue of the day, but working tirelessly to fix roads and potholes and sort out disputes in their constituencies and help the local school with its park funding or whatever it may be, right? So the sort of day-to-day graft of both politics and journalism rumbles on and rubs against each other most of the time relatively well. But of course, what we see and what we engage with the most is that sort of small slither at the top of the process, which is, dramatic and extreme and trades in extremes. And I think we should remember that it is only the froth, on the top of public life, and underneath that there is lots of milk churning away.
No,
to extend that analogy, perhaps beyond its natural life.
No, that's an extremely valuable point, and one that really can't be made often enough. And that relates to the question of the media economy, because although there is a small number of politicians and a small number of journalists who are very shouty, very raucous, very sensational, and there's something about the nature of the media economy that gives them a degree of amplification that is disproportionate to their numbers, as you say, but also their worth. what do you think could be done about that?
Yeah, well, I think you've made the point really well. I think that's absolutely right. Look, technology has completely disrupted the media ecosystem. It has hugely amplified, for a start, the number of voices. It's also just made the fundamentals of making money out of news a lot harder. Commercial news would rely on advertising predominantly, and a little bit subscriptions, a little bit buying the paper, but buying the paper, never really didn't really cut it. That only ever covered a certain amount of costs. Now, of course, technology means that the advertising business is fractured completely, and people are advertising a little bit less on legacy media. Now, I think there are some legacy media brands, actually Times Radio and the Times is one of them, who are doing a very good job actually of finding alternative revenue streams that don't rely on clickbait kind of stuff. But then there's lots and lots of news outlets who are relenting basically to clickbait, right? And you'll know them. You'll go on those websites and there will be sensational headlines, usually involving somebody like Martin Lewis, who's recommended that people over 30 do this or else you're going to die. And that is just very traditional clickbait, and that is all about generating lots and lots and lots of clicks, and so that they can charge more for adverts on that website. But then there are those who do rely on engagement. And it's been fascinating to watch on both sides of the political spectrum, the people who have sort of slipped off to the extremes because it is financially not just lucrative, but financially necessary to do so. There's a broadcaster in particular who I'm not going to name just for decency. He's somebody that I have worked with, and was a relatively kind of quite diligent guy. He wasn't what you would describe as extreme. And it was interesting. I watched him become more and more extreme as his videos got more and more clicks, and I just sort of watched that happen, particularly during the pandemic and over the last couple of years. His engagement rise and him feel the necessity to keep raising the bar, right? Keep feeding this beast. And the person who you would know now is entirely unrecognizable to the person that I knew a few years ago. Wow. And we're quite used to that happening on the right, but it happens on the left as well. I think Owen Jones is actually a really good example of that on the left of politics and journalism as well, who,
right.
Somebody who, and this is none of these points are political. I'm making an observation here, but he is somebody who was regarded as a very thoughtful individual who's written lots of very interesting things about society and some really valuable contributions to public discourse, but has in recent years started to chase down clicks and become a bit more extreme in the content that they are producing. Look, it's really obvious, isn't it? It's a really, really obvious equation, which is that as it becomes harder and harder to make money out of the media, you have to become more and more extreme. Your engagement has to be higher. You have to be reaching a more niche audience. You have to be engaging your audience much more. And the more red meat you feed them, the hungrier they become. And around and around and around we go.
That's really well put. And let me say that if Owen Jones feels that he would like to come onto this podcast to defend himself, there's a seat available for him, as there is for the anonymous person that you had in mind in your earlier comments.
And actually, Owen Jones may dispute that. He may dispute that. I would heavily caveat that with that. That's just my observation.
No, it's really interesting. Just something about the election, if I may. The last UK election campaign was criticised, rightly in my view, for really ignoring the big economic choices in particular that people should have been talking about. The US election was criticised for reducing democracy to the level of a kind of bar brawl. How could good political journalism have somehow intervened in those sort of campaigns to say, hang on, guys, this is what the voters really want to know about?
I don't know, really, if I'm honest. And there's a part of me that's fighting back against this, but I wonder if we may be just beyond that, to tell you the truth. We've reached a point now where our media ecosystem is so fragmented. I think there's some responsibility on the shoulders of politics and politicians. And there is also responsibility with the media and the media ecosystem. But it feels as though we are beyond the era of great persuaders. You know, where are those people in our public life, in our politics, who could hold a view that they reached, not because it was convenient, not because it matched public opinion or it spoke to a certain public mood, although, you know, it sort of got to do that a little bit as well. And, you know, sometimes you're hostage to fortune in regards to whether or not your opinion, you know, is in the zeitgeist at the moment. There are people, you know, Thatcher, Blair, you know, some of those kind of really big characters over the last couple of decades have been both great persuaders, but also fortunate in that the era in which they existed suited their politics. But where are the great persuaders? Where are the people who are holding difficult opinion? Where was the person who's coming out during that election and saying, your taxes are going to have to rise. We are going to have to generate some money from somewhere because we have a public realm to fix. This is going to be an investment in our future rather than thwarting growth or however else you might want to look at, you know, tax rises, and persuading the public of it. Now, it seems to me they don't really exist anymore, those great persuaders. But it may also be because it becomes incredibly difficult to land your message with a mainstream these days. And that's when we turn to the American election. Because obviously one of the sort of key and most interesting elements of politics' interaction with the media in the American election was that there were very, very few set-piece interviews with established mainstream media outlets during that election. It was actually quite extraordinary. And there was also only one debate, I think, between the two of them on the television, which again was very unusual. And it seemed like more than ever before, and it's something that is inevitable and won't come as a surprise, and we've kind of been preparing for, but it doesn't make it any less stark to see it happen, is political candidates, just retreating to their niches. And I wonder if that works for a character like Donald Trump. And it did work for Donald Trump, clearly. He won the election. Less than it works for somebody like Kamala Harris. By which I mean, you know, Donald Trump has a very sort of specific political message, doesn't he? He is, whether this is true or not, I mean, I would question its validity, but it's the playbook, in which he says that he is the great political outsider taking on the establishment. If you have a grievance, if you feel as though the world isn't quite working for you, or you feel in some way persecuted, then here I am with open arms. Come on in, let's band together, and we'll take on the establishment. And that's incredibly potent. And that does give you the opportunity to sidestep mainstream media, not just because it is helpful, but because it's part of your narrative. Well, I'm not speaking to the mainstream media. And you then have open to you podcasts like Joe Rogan and some of those other characters. In that new media space, let's call it a new media space, that sort of ideology, or people who are susceptible to that sort of ideology, are rife. The biggest podcast in the world is Joe Rogan. And Joe Rogan's podcast is sometimes interesting, sometimes terrifying, right? And a hotbed of kind of, you know, misinformation and grievance, etc. It is the perfect climate in which a political figure like Donald Trump can thrive. I wonder if Kamala Harris and that campaign will look back and perhaps reflect that they attempted to do the same thing. They spoke to a couple of podcasters. She did very few mainstream media interviews. She also attempted to reach a niche and to sort of squeeze the most political capital, the most sort of political gain out of reaching those niches. But it didn't work in the same way. Predominantly, I think, because of the sort of the types of people that Kamala Harris needed to win aren't necessarily that engaged with that kind of media, whereas Donald Trump, hugely successful with the types of people who engage with that sort of media. Donald Trump is in many ways the podcast president, isn't he? He's the podcast president. And I think that we will reflect on that as being a really big part of why he won. And I think all of those things in our conversation there sort of tie together, don't they? Right? In this media ecosystem that rewards extremes, that rewards high engagement and high drama all of the time, a politics that is terrified of that because it's not good for them, and a political populism that is using it to its benefit. And we're going to see that a lot more, I think, here in the United Kingdom as our politics starts to shift in that direction too.
That's a terrific analysis, thank you. And there is an enormous amount for me to think about and for listeners to this podcast to think about. So I want to really thank you, Darryl, for giving such thoughtful and impressive answers to these questions, and thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. I hope it was helpful. Thank you.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs. The people that came in, they're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
Yesterday I went, as we all must, to Peppa Pig World.
I'm not going to answer the question
Why
because
would you answer that
because
question?
the question is
the question is justice,
the
radical
question,
left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.